The great irony about working nighttime security is that you very rarely feel secure. At the end of the day, the idea is for the place to be secure, not you. If something happens, some thief tries to break in and steal the goods, or some vandal decides to smash the place up, there is nobody, absolutely nobody who will worry about your personal safety and security. Even when the boss or the central office is on the end of the phone or just a few keystrokes away, you know deep down that really, you are completely on your own. I knew on my first day at the food warehouse that from the moment I clocked in for the start of my shift and the day shift guy clocked off, I would be alone. Sure enough, an hour into the shift, when I tried the communications system to call the area manager, I found that the number didn't work. There wasn't even a dial tone. Trying the backup number, I was asked to leave a message and assured that he would get back to me when he could, so I did leave a message. I asked a simple question: if I am alone, why can I hear people whispering? The sound was low. The sort of low that is deeply frustrating because it rests just on the edge of clarity. There were definitely voices, hushed, quiet voices conversing in these lisping, sibilant conversations that were just quiet enough for me to be able to hear them, but not loud enough that I could make out the words. I remember walking around the warehouse, past pallet upon pallet of food piled high, bags of rice and grain, huge open sacks filled with flour, and straining my ears, trying as best as I could to figure out where the sound was coming from. Eventually, I worked out that the sound seemed to be louder toward the back of the building, and particularly close to one of the large walk-in freezers. This freezer, which was essentially an enormous locker, the size of a small room, was where the meat was stored. The butchered carcasses of pigs and cows hung from meat hooks suspended from the ceiling. The idea that someone might be whispering in there made my stomach churn, and as I got closer, hearing the sound get louder, I began at once to panic. The doors of this room were locked from the outside, and the inside was walled in, so there was no chance that anyone could have broken in from that side, but there was a chance that someone could have become stuck in there if they had snuck inside. Perhaps they had broken in during the day shift with the idea of biding their time, only to end up trapped inside the fridge when my colleague secured the locks. I decided to open up the doors, to unlock the padlock, and see who, if anyone, was inside. Flipping the padlock, I pulled back the door, calling as I did, so as not to surprise anyone who might be in there, and switched on the light. Rounding the edge of the door, I peered inside, and felt my heart leap in my chest. There was no whispering, no people exchanging words. What there was instead was roaches, thousands upon thousands of cockroaches, piled up one on top of another in an enormous, sloping mountain. A pile so high that it reached the ceiling of the room and spilled down like an enormous pyramid or several tons of sand. The sound I had taken for whispering was not voices at all, but rather the sound of thousands of tiny legs writhing on top of one another, squirming and rustling to create a noise like the brush of dry leaves, as a multitude of nut-brown bodies scurred and flitted across one another, building and knowing I would be unable to call for help, out through the emergency exit and off into the night. From the ceiling, the hanging meat remained suspended, but instead of the pinkish blue of frozen flesh, the hanging bodies were instead crusted over with hundreds upon hundreds of roaches, each hunk of meat dangling like some awful decoration as the insects burrowed over and through it, ripping it to strings, and they squirmed and chewed. I watched in panic as they began to pool and leak away from the main pile, lines of hundreds moving toward the door where I was standing. I slammed the door shut and backed away, wondering how they could have survived the cold, how they could still be moving and feeding, but there was no time dwell, for in seconds the awful things were writhing out from under the door, tens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, alerted to the world beyond the fridge, poured through the gaps in the seals and out in an enormous brown sheet that leaked forward as if it was a liquid. I remember that I screamed, that I ran toward the back of the building, and knowing I would be unable to call for help, out through the emergency exit and off into the night. I never went back. Of course I did report what I'd seen, but I was told over the phone that this was nonsense. I had imagined the whole thing, and the day shift security guard had clocked on in the morning and hadn't seen a single insect. Not a cockroach, not a fly, nothing. Couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I asked if there was any security footage that would show the inside of the warehouse, they said that the tape was corrupted and unplayable. What worries me now is not that the company lied or covered up an infestation. After all, they are a company that makes money storing bulk orders of foodstuffs. Why would they admit that they were overrun with cockroaches? What worries me is that they might have been telling the truth, that there really was no sign of the roaches the following day, that somehow thousands upon thousands of these hideous meat-chewing things managed to simply disappear. This worries me more, because I think of the hundreds of bags of food, rice grain, and more that were shipped from that warehouse the very next day. Where, I wonder, are those bags of grain now? Where will they eventually be opened? And what else might be living inside them? I used to think that the worst thing I could possibly see when working security would be the sight of the gates opening whilst a man in a mask forced his way inside. As it turned out, I was wrong. The worst thing you can see in security, the thing that will really chill your blood, is the sight of the gate being slowly forced open by someone who isn't there. The site I was doing security for during that stretch was a car showroom. The cars weren't that high-end, but they were worth enough that some idiot might want to come in and try to take one or two in the night. My job, apparently, was to try to stop them. Every 2 hours, I had to do a full perimeter check of the site. On that perimeter, there were checkpoints with fences, and at each of those, a small screen that did facial recognition. Literally a screen on the wall that would make sure that my face was in the right place at the right time. If I nodded off and missed a perimeter check, or if I didn't get from one checkpoint to the next quick enough, then the computer would know that my face wasn't there, and I'd be in trouble. The gate would only unlock for a face that it recognized, i.e. one that was already stored on the database. That way, nobody else could open locks, or at least that was the theory, until one night, when the gates started to open by themselves. I remember watching it happen. About a month into the job, I was sitting in the control room and keeping an eye on the multiple monitor screens that showed live feeds of the checkpoints. To be honest, I wasn't really paying attention when the first one opened. I mean, how can you? Noonie can sit staring at 12 monitor screens vigilantly for hours on end without becoming distracted. What I will say is that I saw it within microseconds of it opening. I didn't see anyone go through the gate, but as soon as it opened, I detected the movement. When something has been still for hours, and the slightest breath of movement occurs, your eyes are drawn to it straight away. That's why I can say confidently that even though the iron gate creaked open, there was nobody there. Nobody on screen, nobody who had slipped through and managed to get out of shot before I noticed. There simply wasn't enough time for them to have gotten through without me seeing them. Still, the gate had opened. The pad had somehow recognized a face that it knew and had let the gate open. At first, I thought it might be a fault, some mechanical problem. I called my boss at the headquarters and told him what had happened. He was literally halfway through telling me that it was impossible when the same thing happened again, only this time to the next gate on the circuit. The lock clicked and unbelievably the gate swung slowly open. The first two of these things, the recognition and the lock, could have been a fault, some weird malfunction in the machine. But the gate, the heavy iron gate, would only have opened if it was pushed. It required a physical force to ease it open. A physical presence which, according to the monitor and to my eyes, simply wasn't there. The gates were opening by themselves, one after another, Gate 1 and Gate 2. I was sitting in an office behind Gate 4. Suddenly I felt a tightening in my chest. What would I do when the fourth gate opened? When I was left, alone in this room, alone in this entire place and this entire area with whatever was forcing those gates to open, I decided not to find out. Heading out of Gate 5, I went through the exit and again called my boss. This time from outside of the building. Somewhere behind me, there was a sound of shattering glass. At the time, my boss was angry. He screamed down the phone at me and told me that I had to return to my post, to scare away whoever had gotten in. He told me that this was my job, and that if I didn't, I would be fired. By the following morning, he had changed his tune. At a meeting during which I expected to be told that my employment had been terminated, he showed me the security footage. I watched as Gate 4 and 5, on screen and clear as day, opened by themselves. I watched footage from inside the forecourt itself, where 12 new cars were parked, and almost jumped out of my seat when the windscreen of the first one shattered as if someone had thrown a brick through it, despite there being nobody there. The same thing happened to the second, the third, and so on, until every single car had glass strewn in a glittering spray across the bonnet. It was only as I watched the third sheet of glass explode, however, that I realized the problem. The glass exploded, outwards. It was as if something had been thrown through the glass from inside of the car. This despite the car doors never opening and each car remaining firmly locked. It was impossible, but it was also true, and right there on the screen. I had expected to lose my job that day. Instead, I was offered not only a pay rise to double my current salary, but the promise of a lump sum payment if I agreed to keep my mouth shut. I also got something close to an explanation. 6 months earlier, the boss told me, my firm had employed a man called Bridges. He had always hated the management and had eventually been sacked for sleeping on the job. Around a week after he had been fired, he sent a letter to head office saying that one of these days he was going to come down to your stupid showroom and put every one of the windshields in. Though I hadn't known it and nobody had bothered to tell me. It was Bridges my bosses were expecting, and who I was actually supposed to be looking out for. It was his threat that had been carried out and his face that the system had recognized, though of course it wasn't actually Bridges that had committed the crime. It couldn't have been, because he had died a month earlier. Killed, ironically, in a car accident during which he had been flung headfirst through the windscreen. My boss only learned this on the morning after the glass was smashed. What he now wanted to know was whether I would be willing to hold my tongue and continue in the job at increased pay, with the understanding that I would never tell anyone what I'd seen. Obviously, I turned him down. Being alone is one thing. Being alone with something is another matter entirely.